The sun barely crept over the horizon at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado when recruit Marcus Thompson hit the sand for what would become the most dangerous day of his military career. The morning air carried the familiar smell of salt and sweat as dozens of aspiring Navy SEALs prepared for another grueling day of basic underwater demolition, SEAL training. Marcus had dreamed of this moment since he was 12 years old, watching documentaries about elite warriors who protected America's interests around the world. Now, 22, the former college football player from Ohio had survived 8 weeks of the most intense physical and mental challenges the military could devise. His body bore the marks of countless hours of punishment. Rope burns on his palms, bruises that painted his ribs in shades of purple and yellow, and calluses thick as leather on his feet. But nothing had prepared him for Instructor Chief Petty Officer Derek Hawkins. Hawkins stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun and a voice that could make grown men question their life choices. His reputation preceded him through the ranks like a dark storm cloud. Other instructors whispered stories about his methods, how he pushed recruits beyond their limits, how he seemed to take personal pleasure in breaking the spirits of young men who dared to dream of earning the coveted SEAL trident. The morning evolution began like any other. Recruits lined up in perfect formation on the beach, their boots sinking slightly into the cool sand. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before them, its waves crashing with a rhythm that had become the soundtrack of their suffering. Marcus stood in the second row, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his breathing controlled despite the anxiety that gnawed at his stomach. Hawkins paced in front of the formation like a predator sizing up his prey. His cold gray eyes moved from face to face, searching for any sign of weakness, any crack in the armor that he could exploit. When his gaze fell on Marcus, it lingered longer than usual. There was something different in his expression today, something darker and more personal than the usual instructor intimidation. "Today we separate the warriors from the wannabes," Hawkins announced, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of crashing waves. "Today we find out who has what it takes to protect this great nation, and who should go home to their mothers." The recruits remained motionless, knowing that any response would only invite more attention. Marcus felt his heart rate increase slightly, but he maintained his composure. He had come too far to let fear derail his dreams now. Hawkins began the morning with standard physical training, push-ups in the sand until muscles screamed for mercy, sit-ups that felt like torture devices designed by someone who hated the human core, pull-ups on rusty bars that left iron filings embedded in sweaty palms. Marcus performed each exercise with the mechanical precision that had kept him alive in this program for 2 months. But as the morning progressed, Marcus began to notice that Hawkins was paying him special attention. When the group moved to log-carrying exercises, Hawkins positioned himself directly behind Marcus, close enough that his breath felt hot against the recruit's neck. When they transitioned to water exercises, Hawkins followed Marcus into the surf, watching his every movement with an intensity that felt more personal than professional. "Thompson," Hawkins called out during a brief rest period. "Front and center." Marcus jogged to where Hawkins stood, coming to attention with the crisp precision that had been drilled into him since day one. Up close, he could see the network of scars that crisscrossed Hawkins' forearms, evidence of real combat experience that commanded respect despite everything else. "You think you're special, don't you, Thompson?" Hawkins asked, circling around him slowly. "College boy from Ohio. Probably had everything handed to you your whole life." Marcus stared straight ahead, knowing that any response would be the wrong response. The other recruits watched from their positions nearby, grateful that they weren't in his shoes, but also nervous about what they were witnessing. "I asked you a question, recruit," Hawkins pressed, stepping closer until Marcus could smell the coffee on his breath and see the gold fillings in his back teeth. "No, Chief Petty Officer," Marcus replied in the prescribed manner. "I do not think I am special." Hawkins smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a shark that had just caught the scent of blood in the water. "We'll see about that." The rest of the morning continued with increasingly aggressive attention focused on Marcus. During obstacle course runs, Hawkins ran alongside him, shouting criticisms that went beyond the normal instructor harassment. During weapons training, he found fault with every stance, every grip, every movement. Even when Marcus performed exercises perfectly, The other recruits began to notice the unusual intensity of Hawkins' focus. Whispered conversations during brief breaks revealed that everyone could see something was different about the way their instructor was targeting Thompson. Some speculated that Marcus had somehow offended Hawkins during a previous training session. Others wondered if this was just an extreme version of the psychological pressure that every SEAL candidate had to endure. But Marcus knew it was something else. He could feel the personal animosity radiating from Hawkins, like heat from a furnace. This wasn't about military training or building mental toughness. This was about something deeper, something that had transformed a professional relationship into a personal vendetta. As the afternoon sun climbed higher and the temperature on the beach began to soar, Hawkins announced that the day's final evolution would be individual combat training. Each recruit would face off against the instructor in hand-to-hand combat scenarios, learning techniques that could save their lives in real-world situations. Marcus watched as his fellow candidates took their turns. Some performed well, demonstrating the fighting skills they had learned during previous weeks of training. Others struggled, earning themselves extra physical punishment in the form of additional exercises. But none of them faced the level of aggression that Marcus sensed was waiting for him. When Hawkins called his name, Marcus felt his stomach tighten into a knot. He approached the designated training area, a circle drawn in the sand that had become stained with sweat and occasional drops of blood from previous training sessions. The other recruits formed a loose circle around the perimeter, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and concern. Hawkins rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles as Marcus took his position. "Let's see what you've learned, college boy," he said, but his tone carried an edge that went far beyond normal instructor challenge. The exercise began with basic defensive positions, but within seconds, Marcus realized that something was terribly wrong. Hawkins' attacks came with a force and aggression that exceeded anything required for training purposes. His strikes landed with real intent to cause pain. His grappling attempts seemed designed to cause injury rather than teach technique. Marcus found himself fighting not just to demonstrate his skills, but to protect himself from serious harm. Hawkins' elbow caught him in the ribs with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. A knee strike to his thigh left him limping slightly. A chokehold was held just a few seconds longer than necessary, long enough for Marcus to see spots dancing at the edges of his vision. The other recruits watched in growing alarm as what should have been a training exercise began to look more like an assault. Some shifted uncomfortably in their positions, unsure whether they should intervene or if this was somehow part of their education in the brutality of warfare. Marcus tried to protect himself while still following the rules of engagement that govern training exercises. He couldn't fight back with full force against an instructor, even one who seemed to have abandoned all pretense of professional behavior. The power dynamic trapped him in a situation where he had to absorb punishment that went far beyond the boundaries of legitimate military training. When Hawkins finally called an end to the exercise, Marcus was bleeding from his nose and struggling to catch his breath. His ribs ached with each inhalation, and he suspected that at least one might be cracked, but he remained standing, his eyes still fixed straight ahead in the military bearing that had been drilled into him. "That's how it's done," Hawkins announced to the group, but his eyes never left Marcus. "Questions?" No one spoke. The beach fell silent, except for the sound of waves and Marcus's labored breathing. The other recruits looked anywhere except at their instructor and their injured classmate, understanding instinctively that they had witnessed something that crossed lines that should never be crossed. As the group was dismissed for the day, Marcus remained at attention until Hawkins walked away. Only then did he allow himself to touch his ribs gingerly, wincing at the pain that shot through his torso. He knew he needed medical attention, but he also knew that reporting the incident could end his SEAL dreams before they had a chance to become reality. That evening, as Marcus sat in his barracks applying ice to his injuries, he faced a decision that would change everything. He could remain silent and hope that Hawkins' aggression was an aberration that wouldn't be repeated. Or he could take action that might protect him and his fellow recruits but could also destroy his military career. What Marcus didn't know was that his decision had already been made for him. 4 SEAL colonels had been conducting a routine inspection of the training facility that day, observing from positions where they could see everything without being seen. They had witnessed every moment of Hawkins' assault on Marcus Thompson, and they were already planning their response. The wheels of military justice were about to turn with the precision and force of a machine designed to protect those who serve their country with honor. Colonel James Mitchell had seen enough combat in his 27 years of service to recognize the difference between training intensity and criminal assault. Standing in the observation tower that overlooked the SEAL training beach at Coronado, he watched through high-powered binoculars as Chief Petty Officer Derek Hawkins crossed every line that separated legitimate military instruction from personal violence. Beside him, Colonel Sarah Chen lowered her own binoculars and shook her head in disgust. "That's not training," she said quietly, her voice tight with controlled anger. "That's assault with the intent to cause bodily harm." Colonel Mitchell nodded grimly. He had requested this inspection tour along with his 3 fellow colonels after receiving several anonymous reports about concerning incidents in the SEAL training program. Stories had reached their attention through unofficial channels, whispered conversations in mess halls, worried communications from junior officers, and subtle hints from medical personnel who had treated an unusual number of training injuries. The 4 colonels had arrived at Coronado under the pretense of a routine facility inspection, but their real purpose was to investigate allegations that some instructors were exceeding the boundaries of acceptable training methods. What they had witnessed during Marcus Thompson's individual combat session confirmed their worst fears. Colonel Robert Hayes, a decorated veteran of 3 combat deployments, had been taking detailed notes throughout the afternoon's observations. His handwriting was precise and methodical as he documented times, specific actions, and the reactions of other personnel present. Every detail would be crucial in the proceedings that would follow. "We have a clear case of assault under the Uniform Code of Military Justice," he said, reviewing his notes. Article 128, Aggravated Assault. The force used was clearly excessive and intended to cause harm rather than provide instruction. The 4th Colonel, David Park, had been filming the entire incident with a high-definition camera equipped with a telephoto lens. As a former military police officer, he understood the importance of visual evidence in cases like this. The footage he had captured would leave no room for interpretation or denial. "We have everything we need," Colonel Park confirmed, reviewing the footage on his camera's LCD screen. Multiple angles, clear audio of the excessive verbal abuse, and undeniable evidence of physical assault. No defense attorney in the military justice system could argue this away. Colonel Mitchell felt the weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had spent his career protecting the integrity of the military institutions he served, and what he had witnessed represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in military instructors. Young men like Marcus Thompson came to the military with dreams of serving their country, and they deserved to be trained by professionals who would challenge them while maintaining their dignity and safety. The observation had begun 3 hours earlier when the colonels positioned themselves in locations around the training facility where they could watch without being detected. They had witnessed the normal rigors of SEAL training, which they understood and respected as necessary preparation for the extreme demands these future warriors would face in combat situations. But Hawkins' behavior toward Thompson had escalated throughout the day in ways that violated every principle of military leadership and training doctrine. The targeting had been deliberate and personal, the force excessive and dangerous, and the intent clearly malicious rather than instructional. "I want a complete background check on Chief Petty Officer Hawkins within the hour," Colonel Mitchell ordered. "Service record, psychological evaluations, any previous complaints or incidents. I want to know everything about this man's history and how he ended up in a position of authority over these recruits." Colonel Chen was already placing calls on her secure communication device. As the group's expert in military psychology and personnel management, she would coordinate the investigation's psychological and administrative aspects. "I'm also ordering immediate medical examinations for all recruits in Hawkins' current class," she added. "We need to document any injuries and ensure that Thompson receives proper medical care." The colonels had not reached their positions by being indecisive or hesitant when faced with clear violations of military law and ethics. Each had commanded thousands of soldiers in combat situations where quick, decisive action meant the difference between life and death. They approached this situation with the same clarity of purpose and commitment to justice. Colonel Hayes was already drafting the preliminary charges that would be filed against Hawkins. Article 128 of the UCMJ covered aggravated assault, but he suspected that additional charges would be appropriate once they completed their full investigation. Abuse of authority. conduct unbecoming a non-commissioned officer, and possibly even conspiracy if other instructors had knowledge of Hawkins' behavior and failed to report it. "We need to move quickly but carefully," Colonel Mitchell said, gathering his team for a brief strategic conference. "This instructor needs to be removed from his position immediately to prevent further harm to recruits, but we also need to ensure that our investigation is thorough and unassailable." The colonels understood that their actions would be scrutinized by military lawyers, congressional oversight committees, and media outlets that followed military affairs closely. Any procedural errors or investigative shortcuts could compromise the case and allow Hawkins to escape appropriate punishment. They had one chance to get this right. Colonel Park was coordinating with the base's military police unit to ensure that all evidence would be properly preserved and that Hawkins would be taken into custody without creating a spectacle that might compromise the ongoing post-investigation. The arrest would need to be swift and professional, conducted in a manner that protected both the integrity of the evidence and the safety of the recruits still under Hawkins' authority. Within an hour of witnessing the assault on Marcus Thompson, the colonels had assembled a complete investigative team. Military police investigators, psychological evaluation specialists, medical personnel, and legal advocates were all briefed on their roles in what would become one of the most thorough military justice investigations in recent memory. The medical examination of Marcus Thompson revealed injuries consistent with deliberate assault rather than training accidents. Bruised ribs, a displaced nasal septum, ligature marks on his throat from the excessive chokehold, and soft tissue damage that would require weeks to heal completely. The base medical officer who conducted the examination was prepared to testify that the injuries were inconsistent with legitimate training activities. As the investigation expanded, other disturbing patterns began to emerge. Medical records showed that recruits in Hawkins's previous classes had suffered an unusually high rate of injuries, many requiring extended recovery periods that delayed their training progress. Psychological evaluations revealed elevated stress levels and symptoms consistent with trauma rather than normal training stress. Anonymous tip lines established by the investigation team received dozens of calls from current and former recruits who had witnessed or experienced similar treatment. Stories emerged of other incidents where Hawkins had used excessive force, made threats that went beyond normal instructor intimidation, and created an atmosphere of fear that undermined the trust necessary for effective military training. The background check on Hawkins revealed concerning information that raised questions about how he had been selected for an instructor position. Previous performance evaluations contained subtle warnings about his temperament and interactions with subordinates. Psychological assessments from earlier in his career had noted tendencies toward aggression that required monitoring. Colonel Chen discovered that multiple informal complaints about Hawkins had been filed over the past 18 months, but they had been handled at local levels without proper investigation or documentation. The pattern suggested either systemic failure in the oversight process or deliberate suppression of complaints by personnel who prioritized the appearance of smooth operations over the safety of recruits. As evening fell over Coronado, the four colonels met in a secure conference room to review the evidence they had gathered and plan their next steps. The case against Hawkins was already stronger than many they had seen prosecuted successfully, but they knew that justice required more than just punishing one individual. "This goes beyond one rogue instructor," Colonel Mitchell observed, reviewing the pattern of overlooked complaints and administrative failures. "We're looking at systemic problems in oversight, reporting procedures, and command accountability. The rot goes deeper than Chief Petty Officer Hawkins." The colonels understood that their investigation would need to examine not just Hawkins' criminal behavior, but also the institutional failures that had allowed it to continue unchecked. Junior officers who had received complaints but failed to act appropriately would face their own accountability measures. Administrative procedures would need to be revised to ensure that future complaints received proper attention. Colonel Hayes was already drafting recommendations for policy changes that would strengthen protections for military recruits while maintaining the demanding standards necessary for elite unit training. Anonymous reporting systems, regular psychological evaluations for instructors, mandatory reporting requirements for medical personnel, and enhanced oversight by senior officers. As the colonels prepared for what would be a long night of detailed investigation work, they knew that their actions over the next few days would determine not only Derek Hawkins' fate, but also the future safety and integrity of military training programs across all branches of service. The young men and women who volunteered to serve their country deserved nothing less than their complete commitment to justice and reform. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Coronado base as Chief Petty Officer Derek Hawkins walked toward what he assumed would be another routine day of breaking down eager young recruits. He had no idea that his career was about to end in spectacular fashion, terminated by 4 colonels who had witnessed his criminal behavior and spent the entire night preparing an airtight case against him. Hawkins entered the instructor preparation area at 0600 hours, following the same routine he had maintained for the past 3 years. Coffee first, then a review of the day's training schedule, followed by a briefing with other instructors about specific recruits who needed additional attention. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, protected by the informal culture that sometimes shielded military personnel from accountability. At 0615 hours, as Hawkins prepared to address his class of recruits, 2 military police officers approached him with professional precision. Captain Lisa Rodriguez and Sergeant First Class Michael Torres had been briefed extensively on the situation and understood the importance of conducting this arrest with absolute professionalism. Chief Petty Officer Derek Hawkins, Captain Rodriguez announced in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the immediate area. You are under arrest for violation of Article 128 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, aggravated assault. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may be used against you in a court-martial proceeding. The color drained from Hawkins' face as the full implications of the situation struck him. His eyes darted around the area, seeking escape routes that didn't exist and support from fellow instructors who had suddenly developed intense interest in their own duties. The transformation from predator to prey happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. There must be some mistake, Hawkins stammered, but his voice lacked the commanding authority that had intimidated recruits just 24 hours earlier. I was conducting legitimate training exercises. Everything I did was within established parameters. Captain Rodriguez continued reading his rights with the mechanical precision that left no room for argument or negotiation. The military police had been instructed to treat this arrest as they would any other serious criminal matter, with no deference to Hawkins' rank or position within the training command. As the handcuffs clicked into place, other instructors and administrative personnel began to gather at respectful distances, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and satisfaction. Many had witnessed Hawkins' behavior over the years and suspected that this moment was inevitable. Others were genuinely surprised that someone they had worked alongside could be capable of the criminal behavior that had led to his arrest. The recruits in Hawkins's class watched from their formation as their instructor was led away in handcuffs. For Marcus Thompson, still nursing injuries from the previous day's assault, the sight provided a sense of justice that he had never expected to experience. Other recruits felt a mixture of relief and vindication, understanding that the abuse they had witnessed and endured was finally being addressed by appropriate authorities. Colonel Mitchell observed the arrest from his position in the command building, ensuring that every aspect of the procedure was conducted according to military law and regulations. The arrest was being filmed by multiple cameras to provide complete documentation of Hawkins' treatment and ensure that no claims of procedural violations could undermine the case later. Within hours of Hawkins' arrest, the investigation expanded to include other personnel who had failed in their duty to protect recruits under their command. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Walsh, who had received and dismissed multiple complaints about Hawkins without proper investigation, found herself facing administrative action that would effectively end her career advancement prospects. Master Chief Robert Stevens, who had been Hawkins' immediate supervisor, was relieved of his position pending a full investigation into his knowledge of and response to the pattern of abuse that had developed under his watch. The colonels made it clear that accountability would extend to everyone who had contributed to the institutional failures that allowed Hawkins to continue his criminal behavior. The medical examination of all recruits in Hawkins's current and previous classes revealed the full scope of the damage he had inflicted. 17 recruits showed signs of injuries consistent with excessive force during training exercises. 8 had suffered psychological trauma that would require counseling and extended recovery periods. 3 had been forced to leave the SEAL training program due to injuries that should never have occurred during legitimate instruction. Colonel Chen personally interviewed each affected recruit, ensuring that they understood their rights and the support services available to them. Many had been reluctant to report abuse because they feared that complaints would end their military careers. The colonels made it clear that anyone who had suffered under Hawkins' instruction would be protected from retaliation and supported in their recovery. The psychological evaluation of Hawkins revealed personality disorders and anger management issues that should have disqualified him from instructor duties years earlier. Dr. Amanda Foster, the base's chief psychologist, testified that his evaluation results showed clear indicators of antisocial behavior and poor impulse control that made him unsuitable for positions of authority over junior personnel. The investigation also uncovered financial irregularities in Hawkins' personal affairs that suggested possible corruption or abuse of his position for personal gain. Military investigators found evidence that he had been selling military equipment and supplies for personal profit, adding theft and fraud charges to the growing list of criminal violations. As news of the investigation spread throughout the military community, other bases began reviewing their own instructor evaluation and oversight procedures. The 4 colonels who had initiated the investigation found themselves leading a broader reform effort that would strengthen protections for military personnel in training environments across all service branches. The court-martial proceedings against Hawkins began 6 weeks after his arrest. Military prosecutor Major Jennifer Kim presented overwhelming evidence of his criminal behavior, including the high-definition video footage captured by Colonel Park and testimony from multiple witnesses. The defense attorney struggled to present any credible argument that could excuse or justify the documented pattern of abuse. Marcus Thompson testified with quiet dignity about his experience, describing not only the physical assault, but also the psychological intimidation that had characterized his interactions with Hawkins. His testimony was supported by medical evidence and corroborated by other witnesses who had observed the incident. The military jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Hawkins was sentenced to 3 years in military prison, reduction in rank to the lowest enlisted grade, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and dismissal from the Navy with a dishonorable discharge. The sentence sent a clear message that abuse of authority and assault on subordinates would not be tolerated under any circumstances. Colonel Mitchell used the case as a catalyst for comprehensive reforms in military training oversight. New policies required mandatory psychological evaluations for all instructor candidates, anonymous reporting systems for training abuse, regular oversight visits by senior officers, and immediate medical evaluation for any recruit showing signs of excessive injury or trauma. The reforms extended beyond individual bases to become service-wide policies that strengthened protections for military personnel in training environments. Congressional hearings led to additional legislation that provided legal protections for service members who reported abuse and created independent oversight mechanisms to investigate allegations of training misconduct. Marcus Thompson successfully completed SEAL training 9 months later, earning his Trident and beginning a distinguished career in special operations. He became an advocate for military training reform and worked with the colonels to develop educational programs that taught leadership skills and appropriate training methods to military instructors. The 4 colonels who had witnessed Hawkins' assault and taken swift action to address it received commendations for their leadership in protecting military personnel and maintaining the integrity of military training programs. Their decisive action had prevented further abuse and created lasting changes that would protect future generations of military recruits. The case became a landmark in military justice, studied in military academies and leadership courses as an example of how proper oversight and swift action could address systemic problems in military training. The reforms implemented as a result of their investigation became standard operating procedures across all military training facilities. Years later, when Colonel Mitchell reflected on the case during his retirement ceremony, he emphasized that their actions had been motivated by a simple principle. Every person who volunteers to serve their country deserves to be trained with dignity, respect, and safety. The young men and women who enter military training programs place their trust in the institution and its leaders, and that trust must never be violated. The legacy of the case extended far beyond the punishment of one criminal instructor. It created a culture of accountability and transparency that made abuse more difficult to hide and easier to address when it occurred. Future military leaders would understand that their authority came with absolute responsibility to protect those under their command. Derek Hawkins served his full sentence in military prison and was released with a dishonorable discharge that made him ineligible for veterans' benefits and marked him permanently as someone who had violated the trust placed in military leaders. His name became synonymous in military circles with the abuse of authority and the importance of maintaining proper oversight of training programs. The swift justice delivered by the four colonels had ended one man's career of abuse and created lasting protections for countless others who would follow in Marcus Thompson's footsteps, seeking to serve their country with honor and distinction.